From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Weston. Welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. I want to start off today with a check on the markets, and to give us that, we are joined now by Scarlett Fu. So how are we doing today? Not so bad.
Not so bad, David, and the stock market is more broadly positive than a first glance at the S&P 500 and NASDAQ would indicate. The equal weight S&P 500, where every stock is worth the same amount in the index, is up more than 1%. 86% of the members in that index are in the green. Now, the market cap weighted S&P is posting modest gains, up only 0.4%. It is higher for a fourth day, but big tech is actually a drag today, and you can see the NASDAQ 100 down 0.3%, thanks to losses in Facebook, Apple, and Nvidia. The leadership today really focused on some of those cyclicals, energy, financials, and industrials. FedEx had some blockbuster fourth quarter results that's lifting transport companies. And when you look across asset classes, it's very much in the line of when you have loose monetary policy, you've got stocks higher, you've got the dollar lower, gold higher, and bonds also higher. So that's pushing yields down. All of this, of course, before the FOMC announcement at 2 p.m. Fed policymakers are expected to reinforce the policy shift that they articulated last month, lower for longer rates and a tolerance of inflation at 2%, slightly above 2% in the pursuit of fuller, broader, more robust employment. Now, any news that does come out of the meeting will be nuanced around communicating how they plan to implement this strategy. Will they spell out conditions that would justify continued lower rates? Will they clarify the extent and scale of quantitative easing, the Fed's bond purchasing program? The original rationale for buying assets was to bring the market back to smooth funcking. Now it's probably to support the recovery.
Yeah,
for most investors, it's not clear that matters because it's just people want to know that the Fed has their back.
Yeah, exactly. I thought that the Fed kind of said that last time, Scarlett. We've got your back. So what more could they say today? Is that really what the markets you think are anticipating? Sort of the rumor that there's going to be even further reinforcement of monetary policy? Or is it actually the fact of some earnings?
Well, the eco-nerds will be looking for explanation and specifics, parameters on exactly what the Fed is going to say and what kind of numbers they're going to use to keep rates lower for longer. But like you said, most people will get the big takeaway, which is the Fed is there, it's got your back, rates are not going to go up anytime soon. Now, one thing that did get my interest, of course, is back in July, the Federal Reserve made clear that some officials thought there might be need for more stimulus. Perhaps we'll get some insight on what it would take for the Fed to deliver more stimulus, especially when it's really punted the ball towards the fiscal leaders to do more. And we know that Congress has been unable to pick that ball up. And if I'm going to go with this sports metaphor and to run for the score a touchdown, maybe?
Yeah, that's right. You're thinking of Big Ten football, right? Which is coming back, I'm told. That's the big news of the day for me. Okay, thank you so much for Scarlett Fu. And now we are joined by Josh Wingrove because there's news coming out about the coronavirus vaccine, maybe not exactly clear, a little conflicting. So, Josh, what is going on here? We hear Dr. Fauci saying it's going to be at least the middle of next year. Other people are saying maybe sooner.
Yeah, it really depends on who you ask. The head of the CDC is in the mix as well. But Paul Mango, who's the deputy chief of staff for Alex Azar, the health secretary, told us this morning, look, an approval by October is possible, but November or December is more likely. That's a little later than Donald Trump has said. But he thinks if it comes through, that the way they've got their contracts lined up is that every American could get a vaccine by the end of the first quarter in 2021, which is faster than a lot of health officials and the companies have signaled. But like I said, the head of the CDC, Robert Redfield, said it might be Q2 or Q3 instead of the end of Q1. Dr. Fauci, as you mentioned, talked about the end of Q1 being sort of more technically possible than likely in his estimation. So the takeaway here is, on the one hand, no one seems to think that the vaccine can come as quick as Donald Trump says it is, at least in terms of an approval, and it's more likely coming after the election. But on the other hand, they don't seem to agree on how quickly you and I and every American will be able to sort of relatively easily access that vaccine and how many doses they'll be able to have available.
And Josh, we're so terribly eager, all of us, to get this vaccine. At the same time, all this is contingent on actually getting a vaccine that is safe and effective at the same time. Is it clear we are going to have one out of this round of phase 3 trials?
It could be. I mean, they've got, I think, a few right now. They're in phase 3. There are a total of 6 in the Operation Warp Speed pipeline, and their goal is to basically have 100 million doses of all 6 ready to go by the end of the year, depending on which one gets approved. The problem is they're all a bit different. Some need 2 doses, some maybe only need 1 dose. If you get the first dose of one, you can't sub in the second dose of another. They announced today the start of their plan to roll this out, depending on which one is approved first. We also don't know which groups this will be most effective for. In other words, seniors, for instance, would be at high risk of the virus, but we don't know whether the vaccine would work best for seniors or if they'd be at high risk of that too. So there's definitely still a lot of question marks. The Trump administration's view is saying, look, we are maximizing the potential that we will get something as soon as it's safe, as soon as it's possible. But, there are a lot of unknowns here. It is true that, things don't normally move this fast, but, it seems like they just kind of a lot of things would have to line up to be able to get a vaccine by that end of March timeline that one HHS official, Paul Mango, was talking about. That's perhaps why we're hearing longer timelines from the head of the CDC.
Josh, thank you so very much for joining us. That is Bloomberg's Josh Wingrove on the vaccine. In the meantime, as we mentioned, the Federal Reserve Open Market Committee is winding up its 2 days of meetings, and we're going to learn what it's decided just under 2 hours from right now. For a preview of what to expect, we welcome now Jason Furman. He's professor of the practice of economic policy at Harvard's Kennedy School. Mr. Furman also served, of course, as the chairman of President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors. Jason, thank you so much for joining us today. First of all, on the economic projections, what do we expect? Because in some ways, things seem to be getting better. At the same time, we're still pretty worried about this coronavirus.
Yeah, things are certainly a lot better today than where I expected they would be, just 3 months ago. I expect that to be reflected in, the forecast that we see for FOMC members. Particularly want to look, though, for what types of, output gaps they're implicitly seeing for next year. What types of unemployment rates. I think almost all of them are going to be consistent with interest rates staying at 0.
Well, exactly. We're not expecting the interest rates to come up anytime soon, but could we have guidance on things like tying interest rates to the level of inflation, for example, or tying it to some other external factor?
The Federal Reserve just set a new set of long-run goals. In some sense, those long-run goals aren't that necessary for the next year because they would have done the same thing over the next year with or without those revised goals. The real issue is going to be in the future. What happens if inflation rises to 2.5% or 3%? Do they say that's okay because it's still above the average of 2%? Or do they say, we're worried about that, we want to raise rates? So I don't think we're going to see a whole lot of showing of their hand today. I personally think they have the right set of goals, and the rubber is going to hit the road a year or 2 or 3 from now as to whether they apply those goals or not.
Jason, take us inside the process and explain what the model is that the Fed relies on for the sorts of decisions they're making right now. You not only have the uncertainty of the coronavirus, but you also have the uncertainty of the election coming up with 2 very different economic plans being set out by the former Vice President Biden and by the current President Donald Trump. How do they project where the economy is going to go when you don't even know the basic question, are we going to spend a lot and tax a lot, or are we going to cut taxes a lot?
Yeah, the Fed has had a reduced amount of confidence in its models in recent years. They, like everyone else, it's no fault of theirs, missed the secular decline in interest rates, missed the decline in the sustainable rate of unemployment, missed a certain amount of the productivity slowdown. And so they are less about models and projections now and more about where we are right now. And for them, the one number that's most important is the inflation rate is well below 2%. And so, they might want to debate, would they love to have the interest rate be -3 or to have the interest rate be -4? A model could help you pick between those 2 numbers, but they're not going to set the interest rate below 0. So it's really an academic question whether they wish it was -3 or wish it was -4. They're stuck at this corner solution of 0. And, I don't think anything's going to budge them off that, obviously.
Jason, I think just about everybody agrees the Fed has done an awful lot, if not all that it can, an awful lot to help the economy. But the ball may well be in the fiscal court now up on Capitol Hill. Do we expect to hear some nudging, as it were, from the Fed today to get going on that so-called 4th round of stimulus?
The Fed has been nudging on fiscal policy for many, many months now. To some degree, maybe they need to shout in order to get it into everyone's head. Because, yeah, the Fed has done what it can. The main thing the Fed could do was prevent a financial crisis, prevent a seizing up of asset markets, and keep credit flowing. They've succeeded on all of those, but they can't restore aggregate demand, create jobs, protect households, and the like. Only Congress and the president could do that. The discussions got started way too late at the end of July when there was months to prepare for it. And the fact that they're still nowhere is, I think, a bad thing for the economy. It may not, by the way, hurt the economy right now because households have substantial balance sheets, but they're going to work their way through the cushions that they have and end up in bigger economic problems ahead.
Jason, it may not hurt the economy right now, but we did have retail sales numbers that disappointed today. They continue to increase, but not as fast as they were. Is it too early to start being worried that, in fact, because we don't have the supplemental unemployment insurance, we don't have assistance to state and local governments, it may be hurting the economy right now?
Yeah, sorry. I think it is hurting the economy. I just don't think it's a huge harm to the economy in the month of August, which is what retail sales covered, or even in the month of September. And that's because the CARES Act was so large that while many households struggled, the average household had a larger bank balance sheet at the end of July than they had at the end of February. Now they're running through those bank accounts right now. The 15 million unemployed, or nearly 15 million unemployed, they're running through their balance sheets. They're going to run out of money. They're going to face some real, even bigger problems ahead. But so far, yes, it going away is a minus, but I don't think it's going to be a large minus until later on in the year.
Well, and Jason also raises the question, at least in my mind, whether there's going to be money in the larder, if I can put it that way, in case we have a recurrence of the coronavirus come autumn, which some people are concerned about.
Exactly. I think, I'm not an epidemiologist, but I would certainly tell any economic policymaker to be prepared for that resurgence, be prepared for the consequences it has. I think, I don't think we're going to have to do anything like the lockdown we did in April. I think we're much smarter now about how the virus transmits, how it doesn't, and economically low-cost ways to control the spread, like wearing masks, for example. So I don't think there's as much economic damage in our future as the past, but there may be some, and we need to be prepared for that. And again, there's not a lot the Fed can do. That's fiscal policy and health policy that can do something. Indeed.
Jason, thank you so much for being with us. Always enjoy having you. That's Jason Furman. He is the former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Obama and is now professor at the Harvard Kennedy School. We'll have full coverage of the Fed decision and Chairman Powell's news conference with the Fed Decides special. That's starting at 2 p.m. Eastern time today here on Bloomberg. Coming up right here, TikTok has to come up with a deal for its U.S. operations by the end of the week or it's out of business. We talk with the former head of IBM, Sam Palmisano, about doing tech deals with China. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. The deadline for ByteDance to find a way to restructure TikTok's U.S. operations or face U.S. shutdown is looming, with Secretary Mnuchin saying it has to be resolved by this weekend. And reports are that Oracle is the partner trying to get that deal done. We welcome now someone who is no stranger to doing big tech deals with the Chinese. Sam Palmisano was for many years IBM's president and CEO, including when the company sold its PC business to Lenovo back in 2005. We welcome him now back to Bloomberg. Great to have you here, Sam. So as I say, you've actually been through this process. Give us what you learned from that process that Oracle may be facing right now.
Well, thank you, David. Thank you for having me. I mean, the process itself, let me just frame it in the sense that we had a period in time where there were better relations between the two countries, China and the United States. And China was also in a different phase of their growth strategy, and they were inclined to create global businesses that could be housed in China, that could expand beyond their domestic market. So the circumstances were quite different than they are today. Having said that, it's an extremely complicated process. It's run by Treasury. It's a fair process. They make a recommendation to the President of the United States for approval. But normally, at least in our case in the process, it becomes political. In our case, basically because we were selling an asset that we believed was just going to be commoditized. There was not a lot of technical differentiation in a PC as you see today. But fundamentally, the various parties on the Hill got engaged, and it made it complicated, which meant we had to go through a second review, which prolonged everything, which puts the deal at jeopardy. As you know, they say time kills deals. But fundamentally, we hung in there, and we got approval from both governments, and we proceeded.
Yeah, and it's clear, and nothing else is clear. It's clear that whatever TikTok has is not commoditized, to use your word, whether it's the algorithms being used or the data, the personal data, which seem to be the real centerpiece of the concern over national security. And therefore, this deal is more complicated. How you really protect those data. Is that the big sticking point as far as you can tell?
I think it is. I really do think it's a combination of the algorithms and the personal data. And it's the amount of the personal data, and that's called the usage of the personal data. Now, there's solutions that could be had other than shutting people down and those sorts of things. And I really do think that there's a pragmatic solution on the table that perhaps both governments could approve that would at least take one issue off the table in U.S.-China relations. And let me explain what I mean by that. The current, what I read anyway, like you, we only know what's been reported, is that ByteDance would maintain majority share of TikTok, but they would create a global entity that would be housed in the United States. Oracle would be a technology partner and provide that infrastructure, i.e. cloud, et cetera, which makes sense for Oracle. And maybe by doing this sort of thing, if you can solve the issues around personal data and the uses of personal data, and protect people's privacy, that could be resolved. But you still need government approval on both sides. And the Chinese also have the equivalent of CFIUS in their process as well.
Yeah, it's clear that the Chinese have a dog in this fight, without a doubt. But is it possible, from your experience, for the U.S. government to really be assured that those personal data cannot go back to the Chinese government? Because I think that was the thing they were concerned about, right?
Well, absolutely. And basically, the complicated thing here, we don't have any of the details. Let's start with the structure itself. The majority owner being ByteDance is obviously a Chinese company. What's the governance model? Who's on the board of it? How's the entity operate? Are they a passive investor? I mean, I can go on and on and on. Is it a financial deal or is it an operational deal? If it's an operational deal, it becomes more complicated. Now, as far as protecting the data that exists, if it's all housed in the United States, it's somewhat easier. But nonetheless, I mean, the information is going to be flowing across the world. So you're always going to run the risk of any nation or really any hacker being able to get into that kind of an infrastructure. Now, having said that, I mean, I think a partner like Oracle or an IBM, enterprise tech companies who have a lot of experience in protecting data, they do this for themselves and for large enterprises. It's probably a better partner than, let's say, your traditional consumer tech company might be able to provide.
Well, that's exactly my question, Sam, because I don't think of Oracle as being a consumer-facing tech business, unlike a Microsoft or unlike a Google or a Facebook. Why does this make sense strategically for Oracle?
Well, I think actually if you think about cloud, the emerging architecture for computing in the future, Oracle is way behind, as is IBM and many of the other traditional enterprise players. And the leaders, as we all know, are Amazon, and catching up is Microsoft. So to them, it gives them, I think, an entry point with a very large social media company into the infrastructure. I think it will give them credibility in the cloud and moving into the future. So from that perspective, strategically, that makes a heck of a lot of sense. They're going to be a minority investor. It's almost like an outsourcing deal in the sense that you operate people's assets for them, but you acquire those assets, and the acquisition of those assets will be an equity. Again, only as what I've read, so I don't have any insight to that. So, they'll make an investment. They'll get the outsourcing of the infrastructure that'll be housed in the United States, and that will create jobs. I don't know if it's 25,000 or not. I mean, the only reason why 25,000 to me sounds like a large number is because Facebook, as big as they are, only has 75,000 employees.
Well, and finally, Sam, what if in fact it does not get approved? If in the end President Trump says, I don't like this, what does that mean, maybe for Oracle, but more importantly for ByteDance?
Well, I think at the end of the day, I mean, will they shut them down? I don't know. I mean, I think quite honestly, there are ways to solve these problems. I mean, there are national security concerns. I can understand that. It's really the bigger issue is protecting people's personal information. The fact of the matter is, though, David, that all that information has already been hacked. I mean, I know everybody forgets about the OPM hack and the IRS hack and all that. There's a ton of personal information that's already been hacked and it resides all over the world. I assume in China as well. There's tons of personal information already on the internet every day based upon people's user behavior and what they do on the internet. So, I mean, I do think it's necessary and that companies need to protect people's privacy and the data, but I'm not sure that this deal represents what's necessary to solve that problem.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Sam. Nobody I'd rather talk to about this than you. That's former IBM CEO Sam Palmisano. More Balance of Power is coming up next, and this is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. It's time now for the stock of the hour. Cloud-based software maker Snowflake priced 2020's largest IPO last night at $100 per share, but it's poised to open much, much higher. Scarlett Fu is here with a report. Scarlett?
Yeah, David, at one point, the indicated ask price was as high as $240. That would be double the IPO price. So the company raised $3.3 billion, selling 28 million shares at that $120 price. Last week, the marketed range was $75 to $85. That rose to $100 to $110 on Monday. And you could see the IPO price last night was $120. This is the biggest U.S. software IPO ever. It's a cloud data miner, as you mentioned. And this is a company that's seen as a legitimate challenger to Amazon. You had talked about this being the biggest IPO in the U.S. this year when you exclude Bill Ackman's SPAC listing. The backdrop here is that companies that want to go public are rushing to do so before the November election, while there is still some measure of certainty. No one knows what the capital markets will look like, how accessible they'll be in a contested election scenario, or how long that contested election scenario might last. As for who's backing the company, Silicon Valley bigwigs like Sequoia Capital. The latest financing round was back in February, and that valued Snowflake at $12.4 billion. The IPO values it at $33 billion. And of course, we can't forget the Warren Buffett factor, David.
And the Warren Buffett factor. What about Amazon? Is this a real challenge to Amazon?
It could be, potentially, because one way that people look at it is Snowflake is a pure play on cloud computing. Investors can gain exposure to this fast-growing space without having to buy, say, Amazon, which is online massive retail, or Alphabet, which has an ad-based search engine business.
Thank you so much to Scarlett Fu for that report on Snowflake. Up next, Secretaries of State may play an even bigger role than usual in this election. We talked to the one responsible for the key swing state of Arizona. She is Katie Hobbs. That's coming up next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. Top U.S. health officials are giving conflicting information about when Americans can expect to have a COVID-19 vaccine. A top Health and Human Services official said today everyone should be able to get a shot by the end of March. But in Senate testimony today, the head of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention said a vaccine would likely not be available until late spring or summer of next year. That timetable is more in line with that of the nation's top infectious disease expert. Dr. Anthony Fauci has said Americans shouldn't expect a vaccine to be widely available before mid-2021. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is defending his country's troubled COVID-19 testing system after what officials call a, quote, colossal spike in demand. Prime Minister Johnson was questioned in the House of Commons today following reports of many UK citizens being unable to get a test.
What is happening, Mr. Speaker, is that the British people, quite understandably, are responding to that system with a huge surge in demand. And so it's very important that everybody follows the guidance about when they should be getting a test.
Prime Minister Johnson also faced criticism over the turnaround time for COVID-19 tests. In June, he promised that all in-person tests would be back within 24 hours. Giant fires are releasing unprecedented amounts of carbon dioxide and pollutants into the atmosphere in California and Oregon. That's led to the first increase in wildfire emissions in the U.S. since 2015. The smoke is so thick it can be seen as far away as here in New York. The wildfires have killed dozens of people and destroyed more than 5 million acres across the West Coast. The U.S. Supreme Court says it will begin its new term next month by hearing arguments over the phone. The justices who heard arguments by phone for the first time in May said they will do so again for the 2-week session that starts October 5th. The court says it will decide later how to handle arguments in November and December. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks very much, Mark. Every national election puts the secretaries of state across the nation in the spotlight as the ones ultimately responsible for counting the votes. And this year, they'll play an even more important role than usual, with a record number of absentee ballots expected and over 200 legal challenges already brought to various elections. All this week, we're taking a look at the key swing state of Arizona. And today, we welcome Hobbs. So, Madam Secretary, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it. Give us a sense of Arizona. As I understand it, you've had a long history with mail-in ballots. Where are you right now in the process this year for this election?
Well, we are in really good shape in terms of vote by mail. In 2018, 78% of our voters voted that way. And so in terms of having the processes in place, the infrastructure, and making sure that that vote by mail is very secure in Arizona, we are there and ready to and able to handle the increases that we expect for this election.
Could you give us a sense at this point, Madam Secretary, of how many requests there have been filed so far for mail-in ballots? Does it give you any indication whether it's going to be a larger number that you have to end up counting or not?
Well, prior to this election, we had 75% of our voters on the permanent early voter list, but voters can also request a one-time early ballot. So we don't ever know until, really close to the election how many ballots are actually going out. And the mail voters can request that up until October 23rd. So we expect an increase. We saw 88% of voters vote early in the primary election that was just held. And that's the amount that we're gearing up for in this election.
So maybe October 23rd, we'll have a little better sense of how many people have requested this. As I understand it, you can't start counting until Election Day. Is that right?
No, not in Arizona. The county recorders are immediately begin processing those ballots once they start receiving them back in the mail. They get mailed out on October 7th, and they can start receiving them right away. And they start processing them in terms of verifying the signature on the affidavit, the voter signature. That's how identity is verified. And then those ballots are separated from the envelope, ready to be processed and tabulated. And we can start tabulation 14 days before the election.
Which votes get counted? Do they have to actually be in your possession by Election Day?
Yeah, our ballot receipt deadline is 7 p.m. on Election Day. We have a lot of ways that voters can return their ballot besides just the mail. So if they miss the mail deadline, the recommended mail deadline, they can drop it off at a secure ballot drop box or any early polling location or any Election Day polling location.
Now, Arizona's had a little bit of history with voting. In fact, there was a Ninth Circuit decision, as I understand it, just this year about the Voting Rights Act, and some of the laws had been passed to sort of discourage, the court found at least, some people from voting. Is that going to make a difference in this election this year?
Well, that law that the Ninth Circuit overturned is still on the books. It's been appealed. The overturn has been appealed to the Supreme Court, and there's a stay right now. So we anticipate that law, which has been in effect for a couple elections now, will still be in effect, and so won't really impact. There's a couple other pending court decisions that we're waiting on to see how they might impact this year's election.
And the claim, as I understand it, was that there was a particularly disproportionate effect on Native Americans as well as Hispanics, maybe some other minorities. Is it thought that actually it could change the composition of the voting public? I mean, how many Hispanics do you typically have voting? How many Latinos? How many Native Americans?
Yeah, I don't have those numbers up.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Hand.
Fair enough. It's probably unreasonable to expect. But
I think an important
Sorry?
Just to add, I think an important thing in that Ninth Circuit ruling overturning that law is that it did disproportionately affect those minority communities and their access to the ballot.
Yeah. Given the experience that Arizona's had, not every state has had that, and states will be having a lot more mail-in ballots, maybe for the first time this year. What advice would you give, and what challenges have you had in the past? How have you overcome them? What advice would you give to another Secretary of State about how to handle an influx of a lot more mail-in ballots than they're used to?
Yeah, well, I mean, at the point we're at right now, we are less than 50 days from the election. And so pretty much everything that's in place or that's going to be in place is in place right now. So first of all, don't make any big changes right now. That would be my biggest piece of advice. But across the country, secretaries of state have been having these conversations for months now in terms of the things that need to be in place. We've been sharing best practices and support. And so I'm pretty confident that secretaries that are in the position of implementing much wider spread vote by mail than they've had in the past are in a good position to be able to do that. And what's in place now, I think, is where we're at for the election.
What about litigation? I assume that would be handled by the Attorney General rather than the Secretary of State, but you must be following this. As I said, last time I checked, there was something like 230 lawsuits filed across the country. 43 states, plus the District of Columbia, plus Puerto Rico have been challenged. Do you have challenges in Arizona, and what sort are they, if you do have legal challenges at this point?
So there are 3 pending lawsuits, one that we already talked about, and that deals with the issue of ballot collection. So a third party collecting ballots and turning them in, and that's a felony in Arizona. The second one has to do with the ballot receipt deadline, which we discussed. So right now it's 7 p.m. on Election Day. And then the third lawsuit has to do with ballots, mail-in ballots that are missing the signature on the affidavit and how those are treated and able to be reconciled by the voter.
Have you had problem, Madam Secretary, in the past about that verifying the signature? Because there have been some challenges in other states, at least, saying, should we really be asking the people, the election workers, to try to figure out if that signature meets that signature?
So this is a process that is conducted by trained professionals in terms of verifying those signatures. And it's a really important part of the process in assuring voters of the security of the process. That is how that voter's identity is verified. So if there is a perceived mismatch, the county election office will reach out to those voters and have them, verify that it is their signature or give them the opportunity to vote a new ballot. The same thing with missing signatures on that affidavit, but we treat those differently both pre and post election, and that's what the lawsuit is about that I just mentioned.
And finally, Madam Secretary, you're going to have a lot of attention from the media across the entire country come election night and maybe thereafter. Are you staffing up? Are you doing anything unusual to make sure you have the horses in place to really handle it all?
Well, our office isn't staffing up. We are prepared here. We kind of hunker down on Election Day and troubleshoot, and we'll plan on having that operation in place through probably the end of tabulation of the votes. The counties certainly are staffing up for all of the processes that they have to engage in leading up to the election and post-election for tabulation. So I think we're in good shape with that.
Okay, Madam Secretary, this is really helpful. I really appreciate your time today. That's Katie Hobbs. She is the Arizona Secretary of State. Coming up, we're going to hear from the leaders of the so-called Problem Solvers Caucus about the compromise they proposed yesterday to get a 4th round of fiscal stimulus. That's next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David West. We have some breaking news right now. Snowflake, that cloud software company, has now started trading. We talked about it earlier. It is surging on its debut it's going to be the biggest U.S. software IPO ever. If you recall, it was priced at $120 a share. It has now gone up to something like $245. Now I see it at $276. So it's coming in way higher than what was priced. We'll keep reporting on that as it develops. But Snowflake is now trading. In the meantime, yesterday, the bipartisan group calling themselves the, quote, Problem Solvers Caucus unveiled their compromise proposal to try to bridge the gap over a 4th round of fiscal stimulus. Our chief Washington correspondent, Kevin Cirilli, spoke to the co-chairs of the caucus, Republican Tom Reed of New York and Democrat Josh Gottheimer of New Jersey.
Probably like most Americans, we realize that we're in an economic crisis and a health crisis. And we simply can't afford to wait 6 or 7 more months for us to decide if we're going to do anything. The country is hurting, small businesses are hurting, families are hurting. 50 of us got together, 25 Democrats, 25 Republicans in the Problem Solvers Caucus, and said, we've got to do something about this. And, provide some sort of framework to hopefully show negotiators who are working on this, there is a path forward here, and we've stumbled upon one, and we worked together until we figured one out, and that's what we put out yesterday. It's called March to Common Ground.
And Congressman Reed, one of the thorny issues for Republicans has been funding for state and local governments. This puts it at about $500 billion. Do you think that there is enough Republican support on the state and local funding issue to get something over the finish line?
Clearly there is, because in order for us to support this with 50 members of the Problem Solvers Caucus, you had to get 75% consensus. That's the rule of our group. And we far exceeded that. And so that shows that there's bipartisan support. And on that compromise position on state and local funding, we were able to solve that by focusing on what are we looking at? We're looking at making sure that there's enough relief there for folks when it comes to COVID-19 expenses for state and local governments that are based on actual expenses, documented expenses. And then when you talk about lost revenue, that has to be documented lost revenue year over year, not projections, not projected 2-3 years out, but over the foreseeable future, right in the foreseeable time horizon over the next 12 months. And you have to compare pre-COVID-19 to post-COVID-19 so that it's actually documented, and because we're talking about American taxpayer dollars, and you got to have a commitment to protect those dollars and make sure that you're actually giving relief where it's most needed.
So for folks, go ahead.
I was just going to say, the other thing that was interesting, so of course, as you mentioned, we have resources for unemployment insurance. We said after 2 months of $450, it would go up to $600, but no more than 100% of wages to give states time to transition to that. We talked about more resources for PPP, $1,200 stimulus check plus money for children. And then we set up this whole mechanism, which was really kind of the secret sauce of it all. It said if in March, which is why we call it March to Common Ground, if in March we haven't made significant progress in getting a vaccine out, if hospitalizations aren't down, more resources automatically kick in. We call them boosters. So that would get the package to a $2 trillion package. However, if things are in a much better place, and we hope that they are, then there's a reducer. It goes down by 200. So in essence, we allowed room for the virus to understand where the progress of the virus is and beating the virus. And that's what we're really focused on, putting facts on the table.
See, I guess my follow-up question here is for folks outside of Washington, the differences between what the mainstream press has really driven this narrative of $500 billion from Leader McConnell versus upwards of $2 to $3 trillion from Speaker Pelosi. So worlds apart. I mean, not even for Wall Street investors, but also, Congressman Reed, for just mom and pop shops, Main Street. They can't wrap their head around these numbers.
And that was also the difference that we did when we went into the room and negotiated this over the last 6 to 8 weeks, is we didn't focus on the top line numbers. What we did is we got to the substance and looked at reports, looked at data, and said, what do people need for the foreseeable future? Getting us to that March kind of goal is what we were trying to focus on. And when you do that, and you look at the substance of what the American people need, that is what drove us to these numbers. And you didn't look at a top-line number and negotiate from there that a lot of people are kind of thinking of in a traditional business deal. That's not what we did. We looked at the substance.
I want to put this question to you first and then just jump right in, Congressman Gottheimer. I don't want to, I know you're not going to criticize leadership or even the polarization of the two parties, but is there a frustration that in this situation, when you've got the central bank, Fed Chair Jay Powell calling for more stimulus, you've got just walk down Main Street in America and see small businesses that are hurting, families that are hurting. Is there a frustration that there just can't be some type of stimulus?
Frustration is an understatement.
Don't say the word you want to say.
Exactly. It's unconscionable that we would do nothing and leave town and not actually help folks. I mean, we all have constituents who are telling us, families, we've got 14% unemployment in New Jersey, 21% of independent restaurants have gone out of business already in Jersey. Businesses are going out, small businesses, families are hurting, they're having trouble putting food on the table, and that's why we focused also on WIC and SNAP and other food safety programs to make sure people are okay. And we looked at each other and said, we have to find a way forward. There's absolutely no way we can go home without it. And frankly, we found there's a path forward here. We're trying to show that, listen, if you talk to each other, there is a way forward. Please go back to the table, use this framework as a starting point, and let's get this done.
And the good news is we saw yesterday, and I was glad to see the Speaker's public comments, we're going to stay here until we get the COVID-19 deal done. And then we saw Mark Meadows issue positive comments about the Problem Solvers Caucus proposal. This is a worthy proposal for consideration. My understanding is we're probably going to see some more positive conversations out of the White House today about let's get in the room and let's finish this for the American people. And I believe this proposal has been part of that thawing of this gridlock. That's good, because that's good for the American people, and that's Congress doing its job.
So you think that we could have a vote on this, or is this starting a conversation? As you said, the thawing, do you think we're going to get a vote? When timetable do you think?
I personally think, as Tom just said, given what we've heard out of the White House and good news out of Democratic leadership, that there's an interest in staying here to get something done. That means we're going to get something done before we go home, before the election. I mean, people can't, that's the whole thing, as you said, like people just can't afford to wait until after the inauguration to get help, right? I mean, whether you're a small business, whether it's a family, whether you're a state and local government, can't afford to pay cops and teachers, right, and firefighters. These are real issues, and if we don't do something about it, we're going to have, this crisis is not going away overnight, so we've got to help people.
Totally agree. That's why it's imperative we do this now and we get it done. And this is the time frame. We have 3 weeks. We're here. And the proposals that are out there are well versed. They're well out there, and people know what they are here in Congress. And it's just about finishing the dials, finishing the fine-tuning. And that's why we recognize we're not the final negotiators. That's why it's up to the White House, the leadership on both sides in the Senate and the House. And we've been talking to them throughout this whole process. We have a commitment. We don't want to surprise anyone in the work that we're doing here. And at the end of the day, they can move these dials to an appropriate place.
And I'll just add to that, part of the whole conversation we've had the last 6 weeks, and led by Dusty Johnson and Dean Phillips, two members of Congress that we worked very closely with in the caucus, with Abigail Spanberger, Anthony Gonzalez. So there's a whole group of us that have gotten together and said, let's just figure it out. Let's stay in the room. And that's really what we hope to encourage leadership to do, and folks who go back, the negotiators who go back to the table, is, hey, here's a great framework. Stay in the room. Don't go home until you say, here's a way forward. We're all ready to vote. We're ready to go. We think this is a very sensible, reasonable, bipartisan way forward.
That was Democrat Josh Gottheimer of New Jersey and Republican Tom Reed of New York, co-chairs of the Bipartisan Problem Solvers Caucus. Right now, let's check back on Snowflake shares. As we said, at open trading, it was priced at $120. It is bouncing around an awful lot, but it's been approaching $300 now in its trading with an awful lot of volatility. It would give the largest software IPO ever, market cap something approaching $81 billion. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We want to check back in on Snowflake shares. The stock is surging in its trading debut. It's the biggest software IPO ever. Scarlett Fu is back with us. So, Scarlett, you talked about it earlier. It's out there, and boy, it is going up, although a lot of volatility.
A lot of volatility, but it did open up quite a bit higher than where it IPO'd. IPO'd at $120, opened at $245, now at $278. It reached a high of $319. This is the biggest U.S. software IPO ever. It's the biggest U.S. IPO this year. And David, as we were talking about earlier, a lot of it is due to the fact that companies want to go public now while there's some certainty in the markets before the election come November, because who knows what's going to happen with the possibility of a contested election. But there's also a lot of excitement because this is a company in the cloud space, and cloud is fast growing. It's secular growth as well. And we see it in the revenue numbers for Snowflake. Revenue rose 175% in 2019. And in the first half of this year, the sales, the top line, already matched the total for 2019. Having said all that, this is a company that is still losing money on the bottom line. So it is a unprofitable company, a money-losing company. That's not totally unusual for these Silicon Valley startups, and it's got a lot of Silicon Valley money behind it, including Sequoia Capital and Sutter Hill Ventures. It's also got Warren Buffett's support. Berkshire Hathaway and Salesforce.com each committed to buy $250 million in a private placement. Berkshire also committed to buy 4 million shares in a secondary transaction as well. So that just gives you a sense of the excitement surrounding this company.
Is Jeff Bezos nervous if it's a cloud computing company? Are they really potentially a real rival for Microsoft and Amazon?
Well, people say that it's another option for companies, for anyone that wants to build up their cloud infrastructure. And to that end, up until now, companies didn't have a lot of choices. You go with Amazon, you go with the tried and true options. But now Snowflake is out there as another possibility, and perhaps they can be flexible in a way to gain market share that Amazon hasn't had to be. I don't know that Jeff Bezos is worried about much of anything. Amazon is a pretty big ship, and it's got a lot of levers to pull. So even with a little competition in the cloud space, I think Amazon will do just fine.
Yeah, and you make a really powerful point, which is, in fact, there's a fair amount of IPO pricing going on right now. And I guess you said maybe in anticipation of the election, let's get this done before there's even more uncertainty in the marketplace?
Yeah, a lot of question marks over what's going to happen after November. People don't expect to get an answer in early November as to who will have won the presidential election, but this could go on for a couple of months. And of course, you also have to contend with the fact that winter is coming in the northern hemisphere and people are expecting a second wave of coronavirus. The economic data may start to turn south as well. So perhaps the environment, the backdrop for the capital markets are not great later on. Whereas right now we have stocks near record highs. And even though we have this rotation towards more economically sensitive companies away from big tech, there is still plenty of demand for big tech's products and services.
Thank you so much, Scarlett, for all that great reporting on Snowflake. Quite a story. Coming up, Balance of Power will continue on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we're going to talk with Roger Altman, Evercore's senior chairman. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on Bloomberg Radio.